The outcome of human history is hard to predict. All questions of what if are purely theoretical and for entertaining purposes. It is impossible to predict what the modern world would have been if some events in the past happened differently. For this reason, this subject is often disliked, and for a while we removed it from our channel. But after a while we decided to bring it back because, in our humble opinion, by dealing with purely hypothetical questions of what if, you can learn very important facts about the real world. World War I, for example, could have begun 10 years earlier and with a different composition of the coalition. So here is our variation on what would have happened if Germany had won World War I. We are waiting for topic suggestions in the comments for the next videos and feedback from you on whether or not to run the column. It is better to begin the story not with a retelling of the war, but with why it began in the first place. The assassination of Ferdinand of France by Gavrilo Princip was not the cause, but only the trigger. Many presidents, kings, and nobles have been assassinated throughout history, leading to wars only when they were already self-induced. World War I is not an exception, but rather the benchmark. Its roots lie not even in the 20th century, but in the 19th, or perhaps even earlier, when Germany, for various reasons, did not have time for the celebration of the colonial division of the world. For the colonies, it turned out to be a horror of exploitation. And of the European states, it made superpowers, tasting the delights of free labor of the poor folk of Asia and Africa. Patnaik, a renowned New Delhi-based economist, made some noise in 2018 with her sweeping work on the subject of making money from the colonies. In a huge study with lots of numbers, statistics, and facts, it calculates that from 1765 to 1938, Britain took $4 to $5 trillion worth of goods from India. For a second, that's half the total world GDP in 2021. Even if the numbers are inflated by half, India is only one country. Britain, meanwhile, had dozens of them, and France is still featured in scandals about stealing gold from Africa. As for Germany, a cursory glance at a map is enough to realize that the country was too late for the Party of Colonies, simply because Germany declared itself as a state only after unification in 1871 as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. Rwanda, Botswana, part of New Guinea, the Marshall Islands, and a couple of other territories were all given to Germany. And of course, Europe made surprised faces at the new state's requests and declared its borders inviolable. The situation is best symbolized by the phrase of Chancellor Bernhard von Breuilhoff: "Gone are the days when a German ceded land to one neighbor and the sea to another, leaving the sky to himself. We claim our place in the sun." The situation was heating up, and World War I could easily have begun with different commands altogether as early as 1906. France and Britain entered into an agreement in 1904 to create the Entente, but there was no specific talk of joint wars. The treaty only divided the world into spheres of influence, and Germany at the same time came very close to the conclusion of an alliance with Russia. Nicholas Roman II even signed the treaty, and in those years the Russian Empire did not have very good relations with Britain. The big game was on, and skirmishes between the Empire and British ships were commonplace. The alliance between Russia and Germany looked logical, but the French lobby in the government of Nicholas was very strong. It prevented the entry into force of the treaty. Germany switched to Morocco, and in 1906 promised to declare war on France unless it gave the country independence and the right to free trade with Germany. The Germans were rebuffed, and World War I did not begin, just because Germany had zero allies. The country was supported only by Austria at the conference in Algeciras, Spain. Britain, realizing where the wind was blowing from, quickly resolved disagreements with Russia. Well, Germany had to pick up Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and other countries that would later be included in the textbooks as the Triple Alliance. The combinations of allied states in World War I could be anything. And, as a consequence, the first hypothetical plan for German victory, and the war follows from here. Suppose the agreement to cooperate with the Russian Empire still came into force, or Germany somehow persuaded Russia to remain neutral. Would the Germans have prevailed in World War I? Most likely, yes. The famous Schlieffen Plan meant defeating France before Russia entered the war. It failed and was modified 30 times because from day zero Germany was fighting on two fronts. If this front had been won, the Triple Alliance would have had 2 million extra bayonets, 2,000 light guns, and 4,000 heavy guns. Considering that Germany was already holding the Western Front even in 1918, ending the war in foreign territory, it is obvious that with all the troops on the Eastern Front, the Entente would have been doing much worse. But then what? Almost certainly Britain would not have been invaded by Germany because of banal geography. France would have suffered the most, and the closest historical analogy is the surrender of that country in 1940. Many people sympathize with the German situation in World War I, but we should not forget that we are talking about the most ordinary state of its time, and with a huge likelihood, in the case of a military victory over France, the situation of World War II would simply have repeated itself 30 years earlier. Germany with its colonies, its resources, and its dominance in Europe, would almost certainly have turned its eyes to Russia. No treaties, agreements, and past merits are worth remembering. Everyone remembers what happened with similar papers before World War II. Of course, this is our humble opinion, but it is logical to assume that if the war between Germany and Russia had begun not in 1941, but in 1918 after the capitulation of France, the situation for Russia would have been much worse. It is not even in the eternal squabbles between the Tsarist government and the communists. The fact is that the technological lag between the Russian Empire and Germany in 1918 was many times more sensitive. Factories, which in the 41st were transferred to Siberia, in those days physically did not exist. All in all, it is very likely that Germany would not have put up with the last independent rival in Europe, and it is just as likely that the Russian Empire would have joined the sphere of German influence. Paradoxically, such an arrangement would hit the United States hardest. Isolated on its own continent, the country traditionally collects the cream of European conflicts. In 1913, the U.S. foreign trade balance was negative. By 1917, it was $10 billion in surplus by borrowing money from the Allies. After World War I, Europe was rebuilt under the plans of Dawes and Young, which began a period of prosperity in the American economy, because all reparations before entering the balance of European countries passed through the United States. If Germany had won World War I, the news would have been terrible for the US, but not that bad. The catch is that the debts that France, Britain, and other members of the Entente had accrued to the US during World War I would, by tacit agreement, be paid by Germany after World War I was over. In reality, in 1920, Britain, through Prime Minister Lloyd George, asked the U.S. Treasury Department for a reprieve because Germany could not pay in time. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, explained on November 3, 2020 that it didn't matter to him what was going on with Germany. England had to pay on time. In the end, all Britain got was an installment payment for 62 years. According to many economists, this was one of the main reasons for the fall of the British Empire and its loss of superpower status. In addition, Britain could not pay reparations to Germany, having gone bankrupt in World War I after it was over, and instead of receiving reparations, was paying the United States. The funny thing is that nothing would have changed in the scheme with a German victory. Only France would be out of the equation, paying Germany instead of the US, and Britain would still remain in the US sphere of influence, boosting the economy of the overseas country. Dude, you sense that? Yes, the Cold War, which in our humble opinion could have started 30 years earlier. Only instead of the USSR, the US was confronted by Germany, and its resources looked no weaker than those of the USSR. Hitler, with his Jewish twists and turns, would definitely have been left out of the equation, because in real history Adolf took off on revanchism, and without Hitler and the persecution of the Jews, German science would have skyrocketed. For a second, it was German scientists who pioneered the nuclear and rocket industry. It's just that Hitler scattered all the Jewish scientists around the world, and the rocket scientists were taken apart by the victorious powers after World War II. The US also had a trump card up its sleeve, at least in geography, as after all, it is easier to undermine a country that borders dozens of countries than to undermine a country on another continent, with Canada and Mexico on its side. The hypothetical Cold War between the United States and Germany is another story which is almost impossible to predict. But one thing is certain, the conflict would have been no less tense than the US-Soviet struggle in the real world. However, it is worth mentioning that we have chosen the most realistic version of a possible German victory. If we take the way events happen in the real world, the conditions for the victory of the Triple Alliance simply did not exist. The Entente had too much advantage, both in manpower and in industrial strength. But even if we assume that by some improbable coincidence the Germans would have won, the situation would have turned out plus or minus the same as we have described. Britain is locked on an island, up to its neck in debt to the United States. France surrenders, Europe comes under German rule, and a new Cold War unfolds. There are, however, a couple of other fun facts. First, in the Ottoman Empire, which would have lived longer under this arrangement, even as a satellite of Germany, imperialism would have reigned on Earth longer, because World War I was the graveyard of empires and the real world finally killing monarchies as a phenomenon. If imperialist Germany had won it, the elite regimes would have lived longer and military technology would have evolved in a different way. Submarines gained popularity precisely because Germany needed something in World War II to cause problems for the Allies in the face of problems with its own fleet. Missiles, on the other hand, aren't likely to have taken off either. Overall, there's a lot of room for exploration, and if you have any bright ideas, welcome to the comment section. Well, that's all for now. See you later, friends.